The morning coffee tasted bitter in my mouth, more bitter than usual, as I sat at the kitchen table watching my brother Marcus through the window. He was standing beside his brand new BMW, the metallic silver paint gleaming under the autumn sunlight, his fingers trailing along the hood with an almost reverent touch. The smell of bacon still lingered in the air from breakfast, mixing with the faint scent of my mother's lavender perfume that seemed to permeate every corner of our suburban home. Something about the scene outside felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, leaving jagged edges that scratched at my consciousness. Marcus was 23, 2 years younger than me, and up until 3 months ago, he'd been driving a beat-up Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a muffler that sounded like a dying animal. He worked part-time at a local electronics store, making maybe $15 an hour on good days. The math didn't add up, and the sick feeling in my stomach told me I needed to figure out why. My father's voice drifted from the living room, that deep baritone that had commanded respect in our household for as long as I could remember. He was on the phone with someone, his tone hushed but urgent. The words were muffled through the walls, but I caught fragments that made my skin prickle with unease. Something about payments and schedules and keeping things quiet. The wooden chair beneath me creaked as I leaned closer to the doorway, straining to hear more, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Outside, Marcus had moved to the driver's side of his car, and I watched him slide behind the wheel with the kind of satisfaction that comes from owning something you've dreamed about. The engine purred to life, smooth and expensive, nothing like the rattling chaos of his old Honda. As he backed out of the driveway, I noticed my father's silhouette in the living room window, watching too, his shoulders tense beneath his pressed button-down shirt. The phone call ended with a sharp click, and Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, as always, but there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of restless nights. When he saw me sitting there, coffee mug halfway to my lips, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by his usual warm smile, but the image burned itself into my memory. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice carefully casual as he moved toward the coffee pot. "You're up early for a Saturday." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, studying his reflection in the kitchen window. "Dad, can I ask you something?" His hand paused over the coffee pot handle, just for a second, but I caught it. "Of course, Emma. What's on your mind?" The name felt strange coming from his lips, heavier than usual, weighted with something I couldn't identify. I'd been Emma to him for 25 years, but today it sounded different, like he was trying too hard to make it sound normal. "Marcus's new car," I began, watching as my father's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's pretty expensive, isn't it? I mean, for someone working retail part-time." Dad poured his coffee with deliberate slowness, the liquid dark and steaming as it filled his mug. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in around us. He added cream, one splash, then another, stirring with the same silver spoon he'd used every morning for the past decade. The metal clinked against ceramic in a rhythm that seemed too loud in the heavy silence. "Your brother's been working hard," he said finally, not turning to face me. "Maybe he saved up more than you realized. Or got a loan." But there was something in his voice, a careful quality that made every word sound rehearsed. I'd grown up listening to this man tell bedtime stories, comfort me through nightmares, celebrate my achievements with genuine pride. I knew the difference between my father speaking from the heart and my father reciting lines he'd practiced in his head. A loan for a $40,000 car? On his salary? The question hung between us like smoke, visible and choking. Finally, Dad turned to look at me, and for just a moment, I saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that practiced smile that was starting to make my skin crawl. "Emma, honey, sometimes people have resources you don't know about. Your brother's always been resourceful." Resourceful. The word felt like a stone in my stomach, cold and hard and wrong. I thought about Marcus over the years, the way he'd always managed to get out of trouble at school, how he'd somehow avoided the consequences that seemed to follow everyone else. The time he'd crashed Mom's car senior year and somehow the insurance had covered everything without question. The way he'd gotten into college despite grades that should have barred him from community college, let alone state university. "I should get going," Dad said, suddenly urgent.
meeting some clients this morning. It was Saturday. Dad was an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown, and I'd never known him to meet clients on Saturday mornings.
He kissed my forehead as he passed, his lips dry against my skin, and I caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something else.
Anxiety, maybe.
Fear had its own smell, sharp and metallic, and it clung to him like a second shadow. After he left, the house settled into the kind of quiet that felt alive with secrets. I wandered through the rooms where I'd grown up, seeing them with new eyes. The living room with its carefully arranged furniture and family photos that suddenly looked staged. The dining room where we'd shared thousands of meals, the oak table now seeming like a barrier between people who were supposed to trust each other. Everything looked the same, but felt different, like walking through a movie set designed to look like home. My mother found me there an hour later, standing in front of the mantelpiece studying a family photo from last Christmas. In the picture, we all looked happy. Dad's arm was around Mom's shoulders, Marcus and I were grinning at the camera, and everything seemed perfect and normal and right. But now, looking at it, I could see the tension in Dad's smile, the way his hand gripped Mom's shoulder just a little too tightly.
Emma? Are you okay, sweetheart?
Mom's voice carried that particular note of motherly concern that could detect emotional turbulence from 3 rooms away. I turned to look at her, really look at her, searching for signs that she knew whatever Dad and Marcus were hiding.
But Mom looked the same as always.
Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her weekend clothes immaculate despite the fact that she'd been gardening. Her hands were dirty from soil, fingernails caked with earth, and she smelled like roses and sunshine and the kind of honest work that had no secrets attached to it.
Mom, have you noticed anything different about Marcus lately?
She wiped her hands on a dish towel, leaving brown streaks against the white fabric.
Different how? The car. The new clothes. He went out to dinner last week at that expensive steakhouse downtown.
You know, the one where entrees start at $50. Mom's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion giving way to something that might have been concern. She sat down heavily on the couch, the cushions sighing under her weight. I assumed he'd gotten a raise, or maybe picked up extra hours. He said business was good at the store. But even as she said it, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes.
Mom had always been the practical one, the one who balanced checkbooks and asked the hard questions about money.
If anyone should have noticed the discrepancies in Marcus's suddenly improved financial situation, it should have been her.
When was the last time you saw his pay stubs? I asked gently.
The color drained from her face slowly, like water seeping out of a cracked bowl.
He's an adult, Emma. I don't monitor his finances anymore. But I could see her mentally calculating, adding up the cost of the car, the clothes, the dinners out. The numbers didn't work, and we both knew it.
The living room felt heavy with the weight of questions neither of us wanted to ask out loud. My phone buzzed with a text message, the sound abnormally loud in the thick silence. It was from my best friend Sarah, asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. Normally I would have said yes immediately, but today the idea of sitting in a restaurant making small talk felt impossible. How do you act normal when your entire world is shifting beneath your feet like sand? I think I need some air, I told Mom, grabbing my jacket from the closet. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of day that usually made me feel optimistic about everything. But as I walked through our neighborhood, past the neat lawns and matching mailboxes, all I could think about was the conversation I'd overheard, the tension in Dad's shoulders, the way Marcus had touched his new car like it was a prize he'd won rather than something he'd earned. My feet carried me toward the park where Marcus and I had played as kids, past the swings where he'd pushed me higher than Mom thought was safe, past the baseball diamond where Dad had taught him to hit curveballs on summer evenings when the air was thick with humidity and possibility. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but also somehow more significant, like each familiar landmark was a clue in a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. I sat on a bench overlooking the pond where we'd fed ducks every Sunday after church, watching the water ripple in the breeze. A family with young children was doing the same thing we'd done 20 years ago, tossing pieces of bread into the water while the ducks paddled closer with eager anticipation. The scene was so normal, so perfect, that it made my chest ache with longing for a time when my own family had felt that uncomplicated.
My phone rang, Dad's name appearing on the screen. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. Emma?
Where are you, sweetheart?
Your mom said you went for a walk.
There was something strained in his voice, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. In the background, I could hear traffic noises, car doors slamming, the kind of urban sounds that didn't match his story about meeting clients.
I'm at the park.
Dad, where are you really? The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of car horns and what might have been construction equipment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured.
I told you, sweetheart. Client meeting. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. About Marcus.
My heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding my system like ice water in my veins.
What about him? He's been going through a rough patch lately. Financial stress, you know how it is. Sometimes family has to help family, and sometimes that help needs to stay private. You understand? I understood, but not in the way he wanted me to.
I understood that my father was asking me to look the other way, to stop asking questions, to pretend I hadn't noticed the discrepancies that were becoming impossible to ignore. The pond in front of me suddenly looked murky, the duck's movements seeming agitated rather than peaceful.
Dad, is Marcus in some kind of trouble? Another long pause.
When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him over the sounds of the city in the background.
Just, let me handle it, okay? Trust me to handle it.
But trust was exactly what was evaporating, grain by grain, like sand through my fingers. I trusted this man my entire life, believed in his integrity, looked up to him as the moral compass of our family. Now he was asking me to trust him while simultaneously lying to me about client meetings and asking me to ignore evidence that something was seriously wrong. I should go, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears.
Emma, wait. I love you, sweetheart. You know that, right? Everything I do, everything I've ever done, has been for this family.
The words should have been comforting, but instead they felt like a confession wrapped in justification. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The walk home felt endless, each step carrying me back toward a house that no longer felt like the safe haven it had been my entire life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and I found myself studying each one as if they might contain answers to questions I was still afraid to ask out loud. When I reached our street, I saw Marcus's BMW in the driveway next to Mom's sedan. The sight of it there, gleaming and expensive and impossible, made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and dread. I sat on the front steps for a long time, breathing in the scent of Mom's mums and listening to the sounds of normal Saturday afternoon life happening all around me. Lawn mowers humming in the distance, children playing in backyards, the rhythmic thunk of someone shooting baskets against a garage door. Inside, I could hear voices. Mom and Marcus talking in the kitchen, their words indistinct but their tones familiar and comfortable.
It struck me that maybe Mom really didn't know anything.
Maybe she was as innocent in all this as I had been until this morning. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it made everything feel worse. If Mom didn't know, that meant Dad and Marcus had been lying to both of us, maintaining a facade of normalcy while conducting whatever business required secret phone calls and $40,000 cars. I finally went inside, hanging my jacket carefully on the hook by the door like I'd done thousands of times before. The simple, familiar action felt surreal, like I was an actor playing the role of Emma rather than actually being her. "Hey, Em," Marcus called from the kitchen, his voice warm and casual.
"Mom made that pasta salad you like. Want some?" Walking into the kitchen felt like entering a stage set.
There was Marcus, looking relaxed and happy, a forkful of pasta halfway to his mouth. Mom was wiping down the counter, humming softly under her breath. The scene was so domestic and normal that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined everything.
Maybe the car really was alone. Maybe Dad really had been meeting with clients. Maybe I was paranoid and suspicious for no good reason.
Then I looked at Marcus more closely. Really looked at him. He was wearing a watch I'd never seen before, something silver and expensive looking that caught the light as he moved his hand. His jeans were designer, the kind that cost more than most people spent on a week's worth of groceries. His sneakers were the latest model from a brand that charged premium prices for the privilege of wearing their logo. When had my little brother, who used to borrow $20 from me for gas money, become someone who could afford to dress like a catalog model? "Nice watch," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. He glanced down at his wrist as if he'd forgotten he was wearing it.
"Oh, thanks. Got it last week. Special occasion?"
Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it.
"Just felt like treating myself."
Mom set a bowl of pasta salad in front of me, the ceramic cool against the wooden table. The smell of herbs and olive oil should have been appetizing, but my stomach was too knotted with anxiety to feel hungry. I picked at the food while studying my brother, cataloging all the ways he'd changed in recent months.
The changes weren't just financial.
There was something different in the way he carried himself, a confidence that bordered on cockiness. The Marcus I'd grown up with had been funny and charming but also slightly insecure, always trying to prove himself, always looking for approval. This version of my brother seemed to have found something that had given him the validation he'd always sought, and that something was expensive enough to buy luxury cars and designer clothes. "So how's work?" I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational.
"Good. Really good, actually. Management's been talking about promoting some of us to full-time."
But his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it, and there was something rehearsed about the way the words came out.
Like he'd practiced the response in case anyone asked.
Mom began loading the dishwasher, the domestic sounds of clinking plates and running water providing a soundtrack to what felt like an interrogation disguised as family dinner conversation. Through the window, I could see our neighbors across the street working in their garden, their movements relaxed and unhurried. Everything outside our kitchen looked normal and peaceful, which made the tension inside feel even more surreal.
"That's great, Marcus. When do you think you'll hear about the promotion?"
Another flicker in his eyes, another barely perceptible pause.
"Soon, hopefully. These things take time, you know?"
I nodded and smiled like I believed him, all while mentally calculating the timeline. If he'd been expecting a promotion for months, that might explain the sudden upgrade in lifestyle. But it didn't explain the secrecy, the careful responses, the way he avoided direct eye contact when talking about money. Dad's car pulled into the driveway just as the sun was beginning to set, casting the kitchen in the golden light that had always been my favorite time of day in this house. I heard the front door open and close, his footsteps on the hardwood floor, the familiar sounds of him hanging up his keys and removing his shoes. Normal sounds that should have been comforting but instead made my pulse quicken with anticipation. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face carefully neutral.
"How's everyone doing this evening?"
The question was directed to all of us, but his eyes lingered on me a beat longer than the others. There was something in his expression, a question or maybe a warning.
I couldn't tell which. "Good," Mom replied, drying her hands on a dish towel. "How was your meeting?"
"Productive," he said, the same careful tone I'd heard on the phone.
"Very productive."
Marcus looked up from his pasta salad, and for just a moment, I saw something pass between him and Dad.
A look, quick and subtle, but unmistakably meaningful.
It was the kind of communication that happens between people who share a secret, and seeing it made the food in my mouth taste like sawdust. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We watched a movie together, the four of us arranged on the couch like we'd done countless times before, but I couldn't concentrate on the plot. Instead, I found myself studying the profiles of my father and brother, looking for signs of the deception I was now certain existed. Dad's jaw was tighter than usual, his laugh a fraction too loud when the movie reached its comedic moments. Marcus kept checking his phone, the screen lighting up his face with an artificial glow that made him look like a stranger. When the movie ended, I excused myself and went upstairs to my old bedroom. Mom had left it mostly unchanged since I'd moved out, and being there usually felt like wrapping myself in comfortable memories. Tonight, it felt like a museum exhibit from someone else's life. I sat on the bed where I'd done homework and gossiped on the phone and dreamed about my future, and tried to reconcile the family I'd grown up loving with the family that was apparently keeping secrets from me. My laptop was still on the desk where I'd left it during my last visit. I opened it and stared at the blank screen for a long time, unsure what I was looking for but knowing I needed to look for something. Finally, I typed Marcus's name into a search engine, not really expecting to find anything but feeling like I had to try. What I found made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There were 3 news articles from the past 6 months, small local pieces that I'd somehow missed. The first was about a break-in at an upscale electronics store across town, the kind of place that sold high-end audio equipment and luxury gadgets to people with more money than sense. The second was about a similar break-in at a jewelry store in the next county over. The third was about a string of burglaries targeting expensive items from homes in wealthy neighborhoods. Each article mentioned that the thefts appeared to be inside jobs, suggesting that the perpetrators had detailed knowledge of security systems, inventory, and storage procedures. Each one mentioned that police were looking for leads and following up on tips from the community. None of them mentioned Marcus by name, but as I read through the details, a sick certainty began to grow in my stomach. The electronics store break-in had happened on a Tuesday night in July. I remembered that Tuesday because Marcus had called in sick to work, claiming he had food poisoning. The jewelry store had been hit on a weekend when Marcus had told the family he was going camping with friends, a trip that had seemed uncharacteristic for my brother who preferred video games to outdoor activities. The timeline was damning, but it was still circumstantial. I needed more evidence, more proof than a few coincidental dates and my brother's suddenly improved financial situation. But as I sat there in the dark, the laptop screen casting eerie shadows on the walls, I felt the last of my hope that this was all a misunderstanding slip away like water through a cracked foundation. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Dad's voice, low and urgent, drifted through the thin walls. "We need to talk. Now." Marcus's response was muffled, but I caught enough to know they were going into Dad's home office, the one room in the house that had always been off-limits to casual visits. I heard the door close with a soft click, followed by the almost inaudible sound of the lock engaging. Whatever they were discussing, they didn't want to be overheard. I sat frozen on my childhood bed, laptop growing warm against my thighs, listening to the murmur of voices from down the hall. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear enough. This wasn't a casual father-son conversation about work or weekend plans. This was serious, urgent, and secret. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. When I finally heard the office door open, I quickly closed the laptop and pretended to be getting ready for bed. Marcus's footsteps passed by my door without pause, heading toward his own room. Dad's steps were slower, more hesitant, and they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting to see if he would knock, if he would try to continue the conversation we'd started on the phone. But after a long moment, I heard him move away, heading toward his and Mom's bedroom at the end of the hall. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling that I'd stared at through countless childhood illnesses and teenage heartbreaks, but nothing had prepared me for this particular kind of insomnia. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had always been comforting but tonight felt ominous, like the building itself was keeping secrets. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to make tea. The kitchen was dark except for the green glow of digital clocks, and I moved carefully to avoid making noise that might wake the rest of the family. As the water heated, I stood at the window looking out at our backyard, at the swing set Dad had built when Marcus and I were little, at the vegetable garden Mom tended with such care. Everything looked peaceful and normal in the moonlight, but I knew now that appearances could be carefully constructed lies. The swing set where we'd played so innocently might as well have been evidence in a case about a family that had lost its way, and the garden that represented Mom's honest labor felt like a rebuke to whatever dishonest work was funding my brother's new lifestyle. The tea was too hot and tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, needing something to do with my hands while my mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. Maybe Dad was helping Marcus pay off gambling debts. Maybe Marcus had gotten involved with the wrong people and Dad was trying to protect him. Maybe the money was coming from somewhere illegal and Dad was covering for his son out of misguided parental love. Or maybe, and this thought made my stomach churn with nausea, maybe Dad was more than just covering for Marcus. Maybe he was actively involved in whatever was going on. The idea felt like blasphemy against everything I'd believed about my father, but once it entered my mind, I couldn't shake it. Dad was an accountant, someone who understood money and how to move it around without attracting attention. He had access to financial systems and client information that could be valuable to the wrong kind of people. He had the skills and knowledge to help someone launder money or hide assets or cover financial trails. I thought about all the times over the years when Dad had seemed to know things he shouldn't have known, when he'd had insights into local business dealings that had struck me as oddly specific. I'd always assumed it was just the kind of information that circulated in professional circles, but now I wondered if there had been something more deliberate about his knowledge. The tea had gone cold in my hands, but I kept holding the mug because it gave me something to focus on besides the growing certainty that my family was not what I'd always believed it to be. The ceramic was rough against my palms, imperfectly glazed in a way that reminded me of high school art class projects, back when the most complicated moral question I faced was whether to tell the teacher that someone had cheated on a test. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when I finally went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the house wake up around me, to the sounds of showers running and coffee brewing and another day beginning like all the days before it. Except everything had changed, and I was the only one who seemed to realize it. By the time I dragged myself downstairs Sunday morning, the kitchen smelled like pancakes and bacon, the kind of elaborate breakfast Mom only made on weekends when she wanted to bring the family together. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was trying to create connection and intimacy at the exact moment I was discovering how far apart we all really were. Dad was already dressed for church, his Sunday best pressed and neat, his hair combed with the careful precision that spoke of decades of routine. He looked up from his newspaper when I entered, and I saw my own sleepless night reflected in the shadows under his eyes. "Morning, sweetheart. You look tired." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, which somehow made everything worse. How could someone fake that level of paternal worry while simultaneously lying about everything that mattered? I poured coffee with shaking hands, the liquid dark and bitter and exactly what I needed to function on 3 hours of fitful sleep. "Didn't sleep well," I said, which was true enough. Mom bustled around the kitchen with the kind of determined cheerfulness that meant she was trying to hold something together through force of will. Her movements were sharp and efficient, flipping pancakes with perhaps more vigor than necessary, arranging bacon on plates like she was setting the stage for a performance of family happiness. "Where's Marcus?" I asked, noting his absence from what was usually a mandatory family breakfast. "Still sleeping," Dad replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "Late night." I wondered what kind of late night required secret meetings in locked offices and conversations too private for the rest of the family to overhear. The pancakes Mom set in front of me looked perfect, golden and fluffy and decorated with fresh berries, but they tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Church was a special kind of torture. I sat between Mom and Dad in the pew we'd occupied every Sunday for as long as I could remember, listening to a sermon about honesty and moral courage while my father sat beside me radiating the kind of tension that comes from living a double life. The hymns that usually brought me comfort felt hollow, the familiar words about truth and justice and mercy mocking the situation I found myself in. Marcus had begged off church with claims of feeling sick, which would have been unusual behavior for our family if I hadn't already started questioning everything I thought I knew about normal behavior in our household. Throughout the service, I caught myself studying Dad's profile, looking for signs of guilt or remorse or acknowledgement that sitting in church while lying to your family might be hypocritical. But he sang the hymns in his clear baritone, shook hands with neighbors during the greeting time, and listened to the sermon with every appearance of attention and engagement. If this was all an act, he was frighteningly good at it. After church, we drove home in relative silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that families develop after decades of shared Sunday routines. But today it felt loaded with unspoken questions and unacknowledged tensions. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, at the houses where I'd grown up playing with friends who probably never questioned whether their parents were who they appeared to be. Back home, Marcus had emerged from his room and was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking showered and alert despite his claims of illness. He'd changed out of the pajamas he'd been wearing when we left and was now dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than most people spent on an entire wardrobe. "Feeling better?" Mom asked, her voice carrying the automatic concern that mothers deploy when their children claim to be sick. "Much better, thanks. Just needed some extra sleep." But there was something about the way he said it that made me think the extra time at home hadn't been spent sleeping. He looked like someone who'd been busy, focused on something that required concentration and careful attention. There was a satisfaction in his expression that reminded me of the way he used to look after successfully completing a difficult video game level or solving a puzzle that had been frustrating him for days. Lunch was another exercise in forced normalcy, with Mom making sandwiches and Dad talking about work and Marcus contributing just enough to the conversation to avoid seeming withdrawn or distracted. But I was watching all of them with new eyes now, cataloging the small signs that I'd been missing for months. The way Dad's phone buzzed with text messages throughout the meal, and how he'd glance at the screen with an expression that suggested the messages were important but not something he wanted to discuss. The way Marcus kept checking his own phone, sometimes smiling at whatever he read in a way that didn't match his usual texting habits. The way Mom seemed oblivious to both of these behaviors, focused on the meal and the conversation with the kind of determined normalcy that suggested she was working hard not to notice things she didn't want to see. After lunch, Dad announced he had some paperwork to catch up on and disappeared into his office. Marcus said he was going out to meet friends, grabbing his keys and heading for that expensive car that had started this entire spiral of suspicion and discovery. Mom settled into the living room with a book and the Sunday crossword, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she lost herself in the kind of peaceful domestic activity that I desperately wished could still be my biggest concern. I volunteered to clean up the lunch dishes, needing something to do with my hands while I tried to decide what to do with the knowledge that was burning inside me like acid. The kitchen felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls pressing in as the weight of what I suspected grew heavier and more difficult to carry alone. While washing dishes, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. On the counter near the coffee maker, partially hidden under a stack of mail, was a business card. I dried my hands and carefully extracted it, trying not to disturb the other papers in a way that would be noticeable. The card was expensive looking, heavy stock with embossed lettering. It bore the name and contact information for a law firm I'd never heard of, the kind of place that specialized in criminal defense and advertised discretion and confidentiality. Written on the back in Dad's neat handwriting was a date and time, an appointment scheduled for the following Tuesday. I slipped the card back where I'd found it, but the damage was done. Criminal defense attorneys didn't typically handle routine legal matters like wills or real estate transactions. They handled people who were in trouble with the law, people who needed experienced advocates to navigate the criminal justice system. The implications hit me like a physical blow, making me grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. This wasn't just about Marcus buying things he couldn't afford on his legitimate income. This was about crimes serious enough to require legal representation, about a family that was apparently preparing for the possibility of criminal charges. I finished the dishes on autopilot, my hands moving through the familiar motions while my mind raced through scenarios that got progressively worse the more I thought about them. When the kitchen was clean, I excused myself and went for another walk, needing fresh air and space to think without the walls of the house closing in around me. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, with the kind of clear blue sky that usually made me feel optimistic about everything. But today, even the sunshine felt mocking, highlighting a beautiful day that I couldn't enjoy because my entire world was crumbling around me. I walked through the neighborhood where I'd grown up feeling safe and loved and protected, past the houses where my friends' families lived their presumably honest lives, and wondered how many other families were hiding secrets behind their carefully maintained facades. At the park where I'd spent so much of my childhood, I sat on the same bench where I'd contemplated these suspicions just 24 hours earlier. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then, like I'd aged years in the span of a single day. The pond was peaceful, ducks gliding across the surface with the kind of grace that made their movements look effortless, but I knew that beneath the water they were paddling frantically, working hard to maintain the illusion of serenity. The metaphor felt too apt to be comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dad. "Where are you, sweetheart?" Getting worried. The concern felt genuine, which continued to confuse me. How could someone who loved me enough to worry about a 2-hour absence also be involved in something that required criminal defense attorneys? How could paternal affection coexist with the kind of deception that was apparently permeating our family? I texted back that I was at the park and would be home soon, but I needed another few minutes to gather my courage for what I knew I had to do next. The business card had changed everything. This wasn't just about suspicions and circumstantial evidence anymore. This was about concrete proof that my family was in legal trouble, and I needed to know how bad it was before I could decide what to do about it. The walk home felt like a death march, each step carrying me closer to a confrontation that I didn't want to have but couldn't avoid. The house looked the same as it always had, but I was seeing it now as potential evidence in a criminal case, wondering if police might someday be searching through our belongings looking for proof of whatever crimes my father and brother had committed. Dad was waiting for me in the living room, his face etched with worry that looked completely authentic.
There you are. I was starting to think about sending out a search party.
Just needed some air, I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the door with hands that trembled slightly.
Emma, can we talk? There's something I need to tell you.
The words I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I followed him into the living room, where Mom was still working on her crossword puzzle with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was using it to avoid thinking about other things. Privately, Dad added, glancing at Mom in a way that made it clear she wasn't invited to this conversation. We went to his office, the same room where he'd had the mysterious conversation with Marcus the night before. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat for countless father-daughter talks over the years. But this felt different, weighted with significance and dread. Dad settled into his desk chair with the careful movements of someone who was choosing his words before he spoke them. The office smelled like leather and paper and the cologne he'd worn for as long as I could remember, scents that should have been comforting but today felt oppressive.
Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to promise me that what I'm about to tell you stays in this room. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Dad, what's going on? He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk between us. Marcus made some mistakes. Some serious mistakes.
And I've been trying to help him fix them before they destroy his life.
The confession hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and choking.
I wanted to be surprised, but instead I felt a sick satisfaction at having my suspicions confirmed, followed immediately by grief for the father I thought I knew.
What kind of mistakes? Dad was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer.
When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. He got involved with some people who convinced him that there were easy ways to make money if you weren't too concerned with legality. At first, it was small things. Information about inventory, security systems, schedules. He told himself it wasn't really stealing because he wasn't taking anything directly. The electronics store break-ins. The jewelry store heist. All the coincidental timing that hadn't been coincidental at all. I felt nauseous, but I needed to hear the rest of it. But it escalated? I prompted when he fell silent again. They wanted more from him. More information, more access, more involvement. And by then, he was in too deep to say no. They had enough evidence of his previous cooperation to destroy him if he tried to walk away.
So you helped him. It wasn't a question, and Dad didn't treat it like one.
He nodded slowly, his face etched with the kind of grief that comes from making choices you can't unmake.
I've been trying to get him out.
To pay off the people who have leverage over him, to clean up the financial trail, to find a way for him to start over without going to prison. He looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears.
I know how this sounds, Emma. I know what you must think of me. But he's my son.
The explanation should have made me feel better, should have provided some relief that my father was motivated by love rather than greed. But instead, it made everything feel worse. This wasn't just about one person making bad choices. This was about a family patriarch who decided that protecting his son was more important than following the law, more important than being honest with his wife and daughter, more important than the values he'd supposedly raised us to believe in.
How much money are we talking about? I asked. Another long pause. More than I can handle on my legitimate salary. Dad, that's not an answer. He rubbed his temples like he had a headache.
Over the past 6 months, I've liquidated most of our savings, taken out a second mortgage on the house, borrowed against my retirement account, and diverted some funds from client accounts. The last part came out in a whisper, but it hit me like a physical blow. My father, the man who'd taught me about integrity and honesty and doing the right thing even when it was hard, had been embezzling money from his clients to fund my brother's criminal activities. Dad, I breathed, horror and disbelief making my voice crack. I always planned to pay it back, he said quickly, the words tumbling over each other in his desperation to make me understand.
This was never supposed to be permanent.
just until I could get Marcus clear of these people and figure out how to rebuild what we'd lost. But I could see in his eyes that he knew how impossible that plan had always been. You couldn't steal your way out of a problem caused by stealing. You couldn't solve dishonesty with more dishonesty. The hole they'd dug had gotten deeper with every shovelful of dirt they'd tried to use to fill it.
How much time do we have?
I asked, because someone needed to be practical about the situation we were facing. The law firm thinks we might be able to negotiate a plea deal that keeps Marcus out of federal prison if we can demonstrate cooperation and restitution. But that means confessing to everything, returning all the money we can account for, and accepting that there will be consequences.
What about your clients? The money you took?
Dad's face crumpled like he'd been holding that particular weight alone and was finally allowing someone else to see how much it was crushing him. I've been trying to replace it gradually, but there's too much missing. Eventually, someone's going to notice the discrepancies.
Someone's going to notice? Dad, you're talking like this might happen. It's going to happen.
And when it does, you're going to lose your license, your reputation, probably your freedom. Mom's going to lose her home, her security, her trust in the man she's been married to for 30 years. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they needed to be said. This wasn't just about Marcus and his mistakes, or Dad and his misguided attempts to fix them. This was about a mother who was innocently working on crossword puzzles while her world was being systematically destroyed by the two men she loved most.
I know, Dad said simply. I know all of that. But I couldn't let him go to prison, Emma.
I couldn't let my son's life be destroyed by mistakes he made when he was barely an adult. So instead you're going to let your wife's life be destroyed by mistakes you're making as a grown man who should know better. The accusation hung between us like a sword, sharp and cutting and impossible to ignore.
Dad flinched like I'd struck him, but he didn't deny it, couldn't deny it, because we both knew it was true.
We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 30 years of trust and love and family history pressing down on us like a physical force. Outside, I could hear the sounds of a normal Sunday afternoon in suburbia, lawn mowers, children playing, neighbors calling greetings to each other over shared fence lines. All the sounds of a world where families were honest with each other and fathers didn't steal money to cover for sons who broke into jewelry stores.
What do you want from me? I finally asked.
I want you to understand why I made the choices I made. I want you to know that everything I did was out of love for this family, even if the results have been catastrophic. But understanding and forgiveness weren't the same thing, and I wasn't sure I was capable of either one right then. The man sitting across from me looked like my father, sounded like my father, but the things he was telling me came from a stranger who'd been wearing my father's face for months while living a completely different life.
Does Marcus know? About the client money?
Dad shook his head. He thinks I've been covering his debts with savings and loans. He doesn't know about the other sources. Another secret layered on top of all the other secrets, another lie designed to protect someone who probably didn't deserve protection at the expense of someone who definitely didn't deserve to be lied to. I thought about Mom in the next room, peacefully working on her crossword, trusting that the men in her family were the people she thought they were. You have to tell her, I said.
Emma. No, Dad.
You have to tell her. Before someone else does. Before the police show up at our door or your clients realize their money is missing or this whole thing explodes in a way that makes it impossible for her to hear it from you first. He looked like I'd asked him to cut off his own limbs, but eventually he nodded. You're right. Of course you're right. I don't know how to tell the woman I love that I've destroyed everything we built together. You start by telling the truth, I said, standing up because I couldn't sit in that chair for another second. You tell the truth, and then you figure out how to fix as much of this as you can fix, and then you accept the consequences for the parts you can't fix. I left him there in his office, surrounded by the trappings of a professional life that was about to end in scandal and disgrace. In the hallway, I could hear Mom humming softly to herself while she worked on her puzzle, the sound so innocent and trusting that it made my chest ache with fury and grief. Continua a historia. The next few hours passed in a surreal haze of forced normalcy. We had dinner together as a family, discussing the weather and upcoming holidays and all the mundane details of ordinary life, while the secret I now carried felt like a radioactive weight in my chest. Marcus had returned from his mysterious outing in good spirits, chatting about his friends and making plans for the week ahead as if he weren't a criminal whose illegal activities had driven his father to embezzlement. Mom listened to his cheerful chatter with the kind of maternal attention that spoke of decades of loving this child, asking follow-up questions about people I was now certain didn't exist and activities that were probably cover stories for criminal enterprises. Watching her genuine interest and affection while knowing what I knew felt like watching someone pet a snake they thought was a harmless garden creature. After dinner, I helped with the dishes while Dad and Marcus disappeared into the living room to watch football. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see them sitting together on the couch, looking like any father and son enjoying a lazy Sunday evening. The normalcy of the scene was nauseating when contrasted with what I now understood about their relationship.
"Everything okay, sweetheart?" Mom asked, noticing my distraction as I nearly dropped a plate while drying it. For a moment, I considered telling her everything right then and there. It would have been a relief to share the burden of knowledge, to stop being complicit in the deception that was poisoning our family from the inside. But looking at her face, seeing the contentment and trust in her expression, I couldn't bring myself to be the one to destroy that peace. "Just tired," I said, which was true enough. The emotional weight of the day had left me feeling drained in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. That night, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every sound seemed amplified and significant: Dad's footsteps pacing in his office well past midnight, the soft murmur of his voice during what was clearly another phone call he didn't want overheard, the creak of Marcus's bedroom door opening and closing at odd hours. I must have dozed fitfully, because I was jarred awake by the sound of car doors slamming outside. The digital clock beside my bed showed 4:37 in the morning, and through my window I could see unfamiliar vehicles parked in our driveway and on the street in front of our house. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, the official nature of those vehicles was unmistakable. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept to the window for a better view. There were at least 4 cars, and I could see the silhouettes of multiple figures moving purposefully toward our front door. The streetlight caught the metallic gleam of badges, and I realized with sick certainty that our time had run out. The doorbell rang once, sharp and authoritative in the quiet house. Then came the sound of heavy knocking, the kind that announced official business that wouldn't be ignored or postponed. "Federal agents. We have a warrant." The words carried clearly through the house, waking everyone instantly. I heard Mom's confused voice, Dad's tense response, Marcus cursing softly in his room. Within seconds, the entire house was alive with panicked movement as my family tried to process what was happening. I threw on clothes and rushed downstairs to find Dad at the front door, his hair disheveled and his face gray with the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly why federal agents might be standing on your doorstep at 4:30 in the morning. Behind him, Mom hovered in her bathrobe, her face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. "What's this about?" she asked, but her voice already carried the tremor of someone who was beginning to understand that normal explanations wouldn't suffice. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of delivering life-altering news, held up the warrant for Dad to examine. "We're here to execute search warrants for these premises and to arrest Marcus James Sullivan and David Michael Sullivan on charges related to organized retail theft, money laundering, and embezzlement." The words hit Mom like physical blows. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror as the reality of the situation began to penetrate her consciousness. She looked at Dad with an expression that asked him to deny it, to explain that this was all a terrible mistake, to be the man she'd married and trusted for 30 years. But Dad's silence was confession enough. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, and the agents moved with practiced efficiency to secure him. I watched my little brother, the kid I'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and defended against schoolyard bullies, being handcuffed in our family home while federal agents read him his rights in voices that were professionally neutral and utterly final. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar words from countless television shows and movies took on a horrifying immediacy when applied to someone I loved. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was my family being dismantled in real time by law enforcement officers who were just doing their jobs.
Dad submitted to his own arrest with the defeated resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for months. As they cupped his hands behind his back, he looked at Mom with an expression of such profound grief and remorse that it almost made me feel sorry for him.
Helen, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. But sorry wasn't going to fix what he'd broken, and we all knew it.
The search of our house was thorough and methodical, agents moving through rooms that had once been private sanctuaries and turning them into crime scenes. They took Dad's computer, his files, financial records, and boxes of documents that represented the paper trail of our family's descent into criminal activity. They photographed everything, documenting evidence that would eventually be used to prove in court how far we'd fallen from the people we used to be. Mom and I were allowed to stay in the living room under the supervision of an agent who was polite but firm about keeping us away from anything the search team might need to examine. We sat on the couch where we'd watched countless movies together, holding hands like survivors of a natural disaster, watching strangers dismantle the life we'd built. "I don't understand," Mom kept saying, the words becoming a mantra against a reality that was too overwhelming to process all at once.
"I don't understand any of this." And I realized that she really didn't.
While Dad had been protecting Marcus and I'd been piecing together clues, Mom had been living in a version of reality that no longer existed. She'd been the only innocent person in a house full of people keeping secrets, and now she was paying the price for truths she'd never been allowed to know. The agents were professional and respectful, but there was no way to make the process less devastating. When they finally finished their search and prepared to leave with their suspects and evidence, our house felt like a crime scene that had been picked clean by forensic vultures.
"Mrs. Sullivan," the lead agent said as they prepared to leave, "you'll want to contact an attorney. There will be financial implications from your husband's activities that you'll need to address." Financial implications.
Such a clinical term for the destruction of a woman's entire financial security, for the loss of everything she'd worked for and saved for over the course of a lifetime. After they left, taking Dad and Marcus with them, the house felt like a mausoleum. Mom and I sat in the kitchen as the sun rose over what remained of our family, drinking coffee that tasted like ashes and trying to figure out how to move forward from total devastation.
"How long did you know?" she asked finally.
"Since yesterday," I admitted. I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't know how bad it was until Dad told me. She nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful deliberation of someone trying to rebuild their understanding of reality from the ground up. "The house," she said suddenly. "He mentioned a second mortgage."
"Are we going to lose the house?" I didn't know the answer to that question, but I suspected it was yes.
The house, the savings, the retirement accounts, probably everything they'd built together over 3 decades of marriage. All of it sacrificed to protect a son who hadn't deserved protection and to fund crimes that had only led to more crimes.
"We'll figure it out," I said, though I had no idea how.
The next few weeks passed in a blur of lawyers and court appearances and financial reckonings that were even worse than I'd imagined. Dad had stolen nearly $200,000 from client accounts, money that would have to be repaid even though most of our assets were frozen or seized as part of the criminal investigation. The house would have to be sold, along with everything else of value we owned. Marcus had been involved in a theft ring that had stolen over $500,000 worth of merchandise over 18 months, and his cooperation with law enforcement wasn't enough to keep him out of federal prison. He'd been the inside man for a sophisticated operation that had targeted high-end retailers across 3 states, providing security codes and inventory information in exchange for payments that had funded his suddenly luxurious lifestyle. Dad had plea bargained his way to 5 years in federal prison and the permanent loss of his accounting license. Marcus had gotten 7 years, despite his cooperation and his attorney's arguments about coercion in youth and misguided choices. The justice system was efficient in its dispensation of consequences, more efficient than it had been in preventing the crimes in the first place. Mom and I packed up 30 years of family history into boxes and moving crates, sorting through the debris of a life that had been built on what we thought was solid ground but had actually been shifting sand all along. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every small memento carried the weight of betrayal and loss. The hardest part was explaining it all to extended family and friends, watching their faces change as they processed the fact that people they'd known and trusted and respected had been living double lives. Some were sympathetic, understanding that Mom and I had been victims too. Others seemed to assume we must have known something, must have been complicit in ways that made us deserving of suspicion and judgment. Mom aged years in the span of months, the stress and shame and financial uncertainty taking a toll that was visible in every line on her face. She found a small apartment across town, took a job at a grocery store despite not having worked outside the home in 25 years, and began the long process of rebuilding a life that had been completely destroyed by the actions of men who claimed to love her. I moved back to my apartment in the city and tried to return to my own life, but nothing felt the same. Every family memory was now tainted with questions about what had been real and what had been performance. Every childhood recollection included the shadow of wondering what else I hadn't known, what other secrets had been hiding behind the facade of normalcy. The trial was a media circus in our small town, front-page news in the local paper and the subject of gossip that would probably outlast everyone involved. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers and former clients who'd been victimized by Dad's embezzlement, people whose retirement funds and children's college savings had been diverted to fund criminal enterprises they'd never heard of. Watching Dad and Marcus in their prison uniforms, listening to the litany of their crimes being recited by prosecutors who spoke of them like strangers, was surreal in a way that defied description. These were the people I'd shared holidays with, laughed with, trusted with my deepest secrets and fears. Now they were defendants in a federal criminal case, and I was sitting in the gallery trying to reconcile the people they'd been with the people they'd apparently always been. The victims' impact statements were the hardest part. Elderly clients who trusted Dad with their life savings, small business owners whose insurance claims had been delayed or denied because their funds had been stolen, families who'd had to change their retirement plans because of money that was gone forever. Each story was a reminder that Dad's crimes had ripple effects far beyond our family, that his misguided love for Marcus had caused suffering for dozens of innocent people. When it was over, when the sentences had been handed down and the appeals had been filed and the lawyers had collected their fees, Mom and I were left to pick up the pieces of lives that had been shattered by choices we'd never been consulted about. We tried to maintain some kind of relationship with Dad and Marcus through prison visits and phone calls, but it was difficult to find common ground with people who'd destroyed everything you'd believed about family and trust in honesty. They both expressed remorse, claimed to understand the harm they'd caused, insisted that they'd never intended for things to go as far as they had. But intentions mattered less than outcomes, and the outcomes had been catastrophic for everyone involved. Mom eventually stopped visiting them, stopped accepting their phone calls, stopped trying to maintain relationships with people who'd proven themselves to be fundamentally dishonest. She said it was too painful, too confusing to try to love people who'd shown such little regard for her well-being and security. I continued visiting for a while longer, driven by a sense of obligation that was probably misplaced but felt necessary. I needed to understand how people I'd loved and trusted could have made choices that were so fundamentally opposed to everything they'd claimed to believe. I needed to hear their explanations, even if those explanations could never make sense of the senseless destruction they'd caused. What I learned was that people are capable of incredible self-deception when it serves their purposes. Dad convinced himself that stealing client money was temporary, that he'd be able to replace it before anyone noticed, that protecting Marcus was worth any risk. Marcus convinced himself that providing information wasn't the same as committing theft, that he was just a small part of a larger operation, that the people being stolen from could afford the losses. They'd both created elaborate justifications for behavior they knew was wrong, and they'd maintained those justifications even as the consequences mounted and the damage spread. They'd been so focused on protecting each other that they'd completely lost sight of the harm they were causing to everyone else, including the people they claimed to love most. The last time I visited Dad in prison, about 2 years after his sentencing, he looked older and grayer but also somehow more honest than he'd been in years. The necessity of living with the full weight of his choices had stripped away the careful facades and elaborate justifications he'd maintained while committing his crimes. "I know you probably can't forgive me," he said as we sat across from each other in the sterile visiting room, separated by rules and consequences and the permanent damage of broken trust. "I know what I took from you and your mother can't be given back. But I need you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. But it did happen, Dad. Intentions don't change outcomes." He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of that statement in a way that seemed genuine. I loved Marcus so much that I lost sight of everything else. I thought I was protecting him, but I was really just enabling him to hurt more people, including himself. It was probably the most honest thing he'd said since this whole nightmare had begun, and it gave me a glimpse of the father I thought I knew. But it was too late for honesty to fix what had been broken, too late for remorse to restore what had been destroyed.